All right. Let me record. Okay. I wanted to share screen. That's it. There we go. And here is John 9. Jesus heals a man born blind. This is part of one of the signs that John gives us, a sign indicating that Jesus is the Messiah, that he can do unheard of before miracles. So this is one of them. As Jesus went along, he saw a man blind from birth. We aren't told how he knew that, but Jesus knows these things. His disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? The assumption is that this disability was caused by a sin. The way it usually worked is people assumed that it was a sin of that person or his close family. That's they hear the child was born blind. Well, the child hadn't done anything wrong, so it must be his parents' fault. And the bigger picture is that all pain, suffering, disabilities do come from sin, but not necessarily from anybody that's connected to the person. They can, nowadays we know of environmental pollution and how that can cause problems for other people, cancer-causing chemicals and things like that. And somebody else's sin can cause, unknown to them, cause somebody else to get sick. And the whole world has gone awry. In the Garden of Eden, God told Adam that he would have to work. He'd have to contend with thorns and thistles. And it's like the whole world is messed up because of sin. In Romans 8, Paul looks forward to the time when the creation itself will be restored to what it was, liberated from its bondage to decay, as he puts it. Sin does cause, ill effects in the world and in other people. But still, the disciples here, they were just kind of narrowing it down to two. And often when people say either this or that, it's too limiting of a question. There's more to the story than that. And that's the case here. In verse 3, Jesus said, neither this man nor his parents sinned. And it's neither one of those. But this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him. This translation makes it look like that God purposely caused this blindness so that Jesus could heal him and receive the accolades of performing a miracle. There are other possible translations too, minority view, in that this Greek word that's here translated so that usually indicates purpose, but it can sometimes indicate just a result. This happened, and the result is that the works of God might be displayed in him. Another way to deal with the question is to change the ending of the sentence. The way this particular clause could instead go with the next sentence. Now, but this happened, or then rather, so that the works of God might be displayed in him, we must do the works of him who sent me. We're going to, so that the works of God might be displayed, we will heal him. And that can be kind of a purpose clause for what Jesus says next instead of what he has just said. And the reason, none of these are conclusive ways. There's certainly no consensus on giving a retranslation. This is the NIV translation, and they're pretty smart folks, and they know Greek pretty well. But commentators do recognize that, hey, this is kind of a difficult saying. This isn't the way we think of God as working, as causing some difficulty just so he can fix it. So that's one of the difficult verses that translators and commentators and readers of any sort might wrestle with a little bit. Any comments from you? All right. Verse 4, as long as it is day, kind of an idiom for as long as we can, we must do the works of him who sent me. But then he says, night is coming. There's going to come a time when we can't do that anymore. Night is coming when no one can work. Oops, pardon me. And he says, while I am in the world, that's when that's the daytime he refers to. I am the light of the world. He is bringing daytime to the world, and that is the time when God's work can be done. So as long as he can, he will be doing the works of God who sent him. So after giving this explanation, verse 6, he spit on the ground. He made some mud with the saliva and put it on the man's eyes. Jesus doesn't normally need some kind of ointment, even mud, to heal somebody. But this maybe provided some kind of tactile symbol to the man that something was being transferred from Jesus to the man. And to help him understand something about that, I mean, a word of explanation could have done it too. That's the way Jesus healed other blind men. This is not a magic formula, certainly for healing blindness, or even the specific kind of blindness that this guy had from birth. So he made some mud. And that plays a little role in the story later because this was on the Sabbath, we eventually find out. So he put this mud on the man's eyes, and he told him in verse 7, go wash in the pool of Siloam. And John points out that this word means sent. And the man did that. He washed, he came home seeing. It's interesting that John points out that the meaning of this word Siloam. He seems to think that there's some kind of significance there, that the man was sent to a pool named Sent. Well, that's kind of an interesting coincidence. But I suspect there's something deeper going on there too, that maybe John doesn't want to just go out and say, this is the way it is, but he's hinting at something here, that Jesus himself was sent. And that's certainly something Jesus points out several times in the book of John, that God had sent him to do it. So this was a kind of an appropriate name for the pool. Jesus didn't send everybody to the pool of Siloam to wash mud off of their eyes. This was kind of just a one-time thing for this healing. Every healing, it seems, is done a little differently. It's not in a magic formula or a magic substance, but it's simply God's prerogative to do it in different ways. And that's the way he did it here. Any comments on that?
Yeah, I think.
Yeah.
Hello?
Yes.
Yes, sir. I think I agree with you when you said that this is God's prerogative. Because I've experienced where people ask me the same question: why would Jesus use his saliva? Why would there's so many other examples? And the safest, easiest answer I could think of is he's God. He can make his own decisions, and whatever God decides, that's his prerogative. It doesn't mean that we do exactly the same, because we are not God. That's as far as sometimes other commentaries and other people will try to give other meanings, but that's all speculation.
Yeah. Some Greek, people who claim to work miracles did think that there was magic in saliva. but I don't think that Jesus was influenced by that. But yeah, my guess is that it's some kind of tactile object lesson for the man that was born blind, that he can feel something going onto his eyes, and then he can feel it coming off. It also plays into the story too, as I think about it, that Jesus sent the man away. The man didn't know who Jesus was. Jesus kind of created that separation there, and that the story works with that. They come back to Jesus later. Again, with kind of the question, well, who is he? Bringing it up in some sense like that.
Pastor Mike,
do you
think that possibly Jesus was kind of, looking for an opportunity to confront the Pharisees, or the scribes and Pharisees, that if he was doing it publicly, and this would get, doing something like making the mud would get their attention, because this was a forbidden act, according to the regulations. And if he wanted to have, I don't like this term, but they call it a teachable moment, and this is going to last for centuries, of course, but this is a chance to gently provoke some discussion. What do you think?
Point out some of their petty rules, as if healing was also forbidden on the Sabbath, but he could have gotten into trouble just for that. But he adds more. He ups the ante by creating a little bit of mud. Which they would forbid on the Sabbath, because that was what a potter would do as part of his job. So they had turned these general categories into, very legalistic rules of even the smallest amount of, how far can you walk on the Sabbath? Well, they counted the number of steps, and those kinds of focus on exactly defining exactly what you can and can't do. But then they'd find ways around that too. And the example of kind of the number of steps that you could take on the Sabbath, if you left some property kind of halfway between where you wanted to go, you could go take that many steps to your property, and then you could go take that many steps further on. So if you had planned ahead, you could walk further than a Sabbath day's journey. Kind of bending their rules. Partly, I think they realize, well, the rules are too strict. They need exceptions. So they've figured out some other way. Instead of changing the rule, they kind of created some exceptions for that. That's not the story here. The story here is making mud, and even a little bit of mud with spit.
I just follow up. You mentioned a while ago, and I agree, the word, there's so that. Remember you mentioned that this happened so that, and then you say it may not mean that. That's possible too. But is it also possible that, using the same reasoning, that God can choose to, make this thing happen, as Janet is saying here, to evoke kind of something from the Pharisees, so that he can show them that he is the Messiah. He's God, after all, that he might, only for that particular instance, the so that applies. Cannot apply it generally. Just a thought, I can be wrong.
Yeah, I think some would go for that, but others would still say that just doesn't not seem like God, that he would cause this man, so many years of inconvenience. When there are plenty of people that are born blind for other reasons, that Jesus could have healed one of those and still gotten the same the same sign significance, the mileage out of it. There are plenty of other things going wrong that Jesus could have fixed without causing one in particular. But as we said, it's his prerogative. He knows more about things than we do. All of us go through some kind of inconvenience in our life. We are not as skilled as we could have been. We all have some limitations. I certainly cannot do the same things that Shaquille O'Neal can do. Does that make me less able? Well, yes, I am less able, but that doesn't make me disabled either. That's a minor thing. So yeah, we all have some discomforts, and that is what God told Adam would happen. Well, like with Eve, he says, in pain you'll bring forth children. These things, that's a result of sin in general. So yeah, some things happen like that, and that is the way God, designed the world. So yeah, I can see both sides of that.
So Mike.
Yes, June.
We watched The Chosen, and I'm not sure if anybody's seen that series. And I like how they pictured Jesus purposely going to these the blind or the lame, like he had an appointment with them, or he knew them in advance, and he went to them and healed them.
Yes.
Kind of like what may be done here, that it's a sovereign act of God that this man is here. I thought that was interesting for them to show that.
Yeah, it's kind of Jesus seeking them out. I think the best example is the man who had a legion of demons. Jesus and his disciples got in the boat, went over there, cast the demons out, and then they went back. That's all they did. It's just like that. Jesus went there for that specific purpose. So some of that is going on there too, that Jesus could seek them out. At the pool of Bethesda, well, there were lots of people hanging around the pool of Bethesda waiting for the water to stir so they could get in and be healed. But Jesus sought one of them out in particular for reasons we don't know.
It's interesting.
Yeah.
I was wondering, Pastor Mike,
yes,
if a lot of the reasons possibly of the healings in the New Testament were, like a physical demonstration of a spiritual meaning or reality. Because what's more important than physical healing is spiritual healing, is seeing Jesus for who he is. And I don't know. I think particularly in water turning to wine, we can see some spiritual significance there. Here, certainly in blindness, we can see there's an easy correspondence with spiritual sight or ability to understand. Whether it's healing, or certainly those people that Jesus raised from the dead, that too has a spiritual significance. Healing someone who's lame, maybe we don't have such a direct spiritual counterpart to that, except in I'm just thinking off the top of my head here, the common metaphor of walking in the way, which is
it was a common Hebrew expression of how a person lived, was walking. It was the halakha, is what in Hebrew, and that was how a person walked. So yeah, that's I can see with a little creativity we can see the spiritual counterparts of at least a lot of these healings.
Yeah, and even in the new heaven and new earth, there will be completeness. There will be healing for the lame and the sick, and new bodies, and
right.
Yeah.
Pictured by the trees that grow in the river of the water of life, and the leaves are for healing. Picturing restoration of our body, mind, spirit, the whole package.
Yeah, Pastor Mike.
Yes, Millette.
With the blind, really blind since birth, it's really like impossible even up to now. Somehow when you're blind, sometimes those people don't even have eyeballs. They're really totally blind. And this
right.
is
and
miracle to show.
And their brains, how would they sort out the nerve
how can you go
signals? That's a very complex process.
Exactly. And as what we know, that he did not only heal one or two blind people, but I guess in his 3 years, there are more blind people and that he healed. And one of them was even an eyewitness. When I say eyewitness, he didn't have eyes, but he was an eyewitness and say, is it true that you healed this guy? This guy healed you? And he say, I don't know, but all I say that before I cannot see, now I see. So just like he's the testimony of a blind who became a seeing man, you cannot beat that. And all those people surrounding him saying, we know this guy, he used to be blind. So there are also eyewitnesses that, that this guy. So it's just to glorify really God, and you cannot like doubt it at all, because a man with no eyes or no seeing can see. So it's just like you cannot doubt that it is God's work.
Yeah. That's you were paraphrasing some of the rest of this chapter. we can take a look at, let's see, here, share screen, go back to the text, and here, verse 8. His neighbors and those who had formerly seen him begging asked, isn't this the same man who used to sit and beg? Some claimed that he was. Others said, no, he only looks like him. But he himself insisted, I am the man. Well, how then were your eyes opened? They asked. Like any reasonable person would ask the same thing. Wow, how did that happen? He replied, the man they call Jesus made some mud and put it on my eyes. He told me to go to Siloam and wash. So I went and washed, and then I could see. So there's the basic outline of the story. Verse 12, where is this man? They asked him. No, he didn't know. He'd gone their different ways. So all this was very good news for the man, but it got him in trouble. Verse 13, they brought this man to the Pharisees. Now, like, why did they do that? Did they know what the Pharisees would think of this? Were they seeking the Pharisees' approval? Were they trying to say, wow, look at what a marvelous thing God has done? We're not really told what the motives of the neighbors were. But anyway, it just brings the story into a conflict then. All right, the man, they bring this man to the Pharisees. And then now in the story, we are told, verse 14, the day on which Jesus had made the mud and opened man's eyes was a Sabbath. So that gives the story a different spin now. So, just verse 15, the Pharisees also asked him how he had received his sight. He put mud on my eyes, the man replied, and I washed, and now I see. That's the basic story. Some of the Pharisees said, this man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath. He didn't keep our rules. They didn't distinguish between their rules and God's rules, not realizing that they were an interpretation. And I think what they should have done and said, hey, maybe that says something about our rules, but no, they didn't entertain that thought. Others asked, in the last part of verse 16, people asked, how can a sinner perform such signs? How could Jesus be a sinner? I mean, he's doing great things. Why, would God enable a sinner to do such things? So they were divided. Some of the Pharisees said this, some said that. Verse 17, they turned again to the blind man. Oh, well, it's like, here, the experts don't know what's going on. What do you say? What do you have to say about him? It was your eyes he opened. The man replied, he is a prophet. He is somebody sent from God. But verse 18, they still didn't believe that he had been blind and had received his sight until they sent for the man's parents. So they asked him what he thought, but then at least some of them ignored it, what he said. So they sent for the man's parents. Verse 19, is this your son, they asked? Is this the one you say was born blind? How is it that he now can see? Well, the parents figured out that there was some kind of controversy going on, and they didn't want to be part of it. So they just kind of just stuck to the facts. We know he is our son, the parents answered, and we know he was born blind. But how he can see now, or who opened his eyes, we don't know. Ask him. He is of age. He will speak for himself. So they just kind of passed the buck. Verse 22 tells us why. His parents said this because they were afraid of the Jewish leaders, who had already decided that anyone who acknowledged that Jesus was the Messiah would be put out of the synagogue. And they didn't want to be put out of the synagogue. They could have thought, well, if the synagogue kicks him out, maybe the synagogue isn't worth being a part of. But that was not part of their thinking. So his parents said in verse 23, he is of age, ask him. Don't you keep us out of this. John is telling this part of the story. I don't know. I'm not sure why. It tells us something about attitudes among some of the Jews, and it might be relevant to the social situation when John was writing, that there was some conflict between the early Christians and the synagogues. And they're kind of explaining, all right, some of the synagogue people are hostile, and other people in the synagogue, they don't really want to be a part. They don't want to take sides. They back off because they're afraid. And that maybe this part of the story would kind of speak to that situation. And, social groups can be pretty complex, and why people want to be in a particular group. In some ways, these parents of the man born blind, because he was born blind, they would have been blamed all along. Rumors and
a little gossip of they must have done something wrong for this baby to be born blind. And yet they still desperately wanted to be accepted by the synagogue. I don't know, that's something for psychologists to discuss, I suppose. Maybe they've come across other situations in which people make that kind of decision, in a way seeking to want to be with the group that has hurt them. Maybe I'm digging too deeply there. Any thoughts from you on any of these verses?
Yeah, Pastor Mike.
Yes.
Yeah, I think you're right. Especially in the Eastern culture, the aspect of guilt and shame. I read somewhere that for the Western culture, they put more weight and gravity as far as guilt. For the Eastern culture, they put weight on shame. And so relationally, them being cut off from the community is a form of a shame, and they don't want that. Now, when it comes also with the Pharisees, it's like what Peggy mentioned. There's the kind of spiritual blindness. And the Pharisees are here, in this case, spiritually blind. And it's more difficult to heal them than the man who was physically blind.
Right. They've chosen to be blind. Yeah, thank you.
Mike, it's hard not to want to be part of your community. And I've heard that in the Middle Eastern culture, or many other cultures, the group is much more important than the individual. And in our culture, we're very individualistic, but they aren't always. And sometimes you just feel like it's better to keep your mouth shut. You don't want to enter into the conflict because you really don't know where it can take you. You don't understand it well enough to take a stand on it. I'm sure his parents were surprised. They didn't know what to think, probably, but they did know that it would be bad for them to be cut off from the community and their synagogue. We have seen things in our own church that we don't want to be cut off from the church. We may not understand things, might even disagree sometimes, but we don't want to be cut off from the church.
It reminds me of the proverb that somehow the better the devil you know than the one you don't. And the people that were afraid of the unknown, they didn't know what would happen if they sided with Jesus. Yeah. Mm-hmm. All right, let's go back. All right, verse 24. A second time they summoned the man who had been blind. Give glory to God by telling the truth, they said. It's like they were commanding him to tell the truth as if he weren't before. It says, we know this man is a sinner. It says, no, it couldn't have happened the way you told the story, because we know that he's a sinner. Well, verse 25, the man replied, whether he's a sinner or not, I don't know. One thing I do know, I was blind, but now I see. He is just sticking to the facts. That's commendable. They asked him, what did he do to you? How did he open your eyes? He answered, I've already told you, and you didn't listen. Do you want to hear it again? Do you want to become his disciples too? I'm pretty sure he didn't really think that they did. There was but it's like, why are you keep asking me the same question? Well, no, they didn't want to become his disciples. Verse 28, they hurled insults at him and said, you are this fellow's disciple. We are disciples of Moses. So John there's this contrast here between Jesus and Moses. People need to make a decision, one or the other. We know that God spoke to Moses, but as for this fellow, we don't even know where he comes from. That's kind of playing that angle again that we saw in earlier chapters. It doesn't matter where the guy is from. Well, Jesus said he came from God, but they didn't know that. They didn't know where he came from physically or spiritually. Verse 30, the man answered, now that is remarkable. You don't know where he comes from, and yet he opened my eyes. He's got amazing power. You ought to know. We know that God doesn't listen to sinners. So the man does, he knows. And he's becoming more blunt or open with his opinion here, because they've already hurled insults at him. They've already created division. The man knows he's not going to be accepted, so he just sides with Jesus more openly here. We know that God does not listen to sinners. He listens to the godly person who does his will. Nobody has ever heard of opening the eyes of a man born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. So this man is saying, and John, by repeating this story, is agreeing with it, evidence that, hey, this kind of miracle points to who Jesus is. This is a stupendous thing. No, this is hasn't happened before. So at the least that we can say is this man is from God. He's doing these good things. All right, that's at a minimum that he is from God. Well, verse 34, to this they replied, you were steeped in sin at birth. Well, yeah, going back to the idea that somebody's sin had caused his blindness. So therefore, his opinion couldn't be correct. Yeah, right. And the evidence that he was steeped in sin at birth is now gone. Somebody had more power than that to be able to turn that around. And he said, well, how dare you lecture us? They threw him out of the synagogue. So he was an outcast, and presumably he became one of the followers of Jesus. Whether he followed him all the time or just stayed in the original location, we don't know. But as the Christian movement grew, it no doubt included people that had experienced Jesus personally like this. Then John, is taking it to the spiritual level here. Jesus heard that they had thrown him out. When Jesus found the man, he said, do you believe in the Son of Man? Well, it's interesting that the man would even know that terminology, and that wasn't the most common way of referring to the Messiah back then. In fact, Jesus seemed to use that term for himself, partly because it was not too closely associated with the messianic role. But here we could paraphrase this. Do you believe in me? Jesus used Son of Man to refer to himself. Do you believe in me? Do you trust me? But the man was replying, well, who is he? Who has this kind of title? Tell me so that I may believe in him. It's interesting. Even if he's talking about a third person here, this formerly blind man said, all right, I will believe in that man if you say so. He is already trusting in Jesus, the one who says so. So he's already trusting in Jesus to point him to whoever whoever is sent from God. But verse 37, so Jesus says, clarifies that you have now seen him, and he's the one speaking with you. That's who I am. I'm the Son of Man. And the man said, Lord, I believe. I trust you. And he worshiped him. The Greek word for worship is kneel. It's customary. The word doesn't always mean worship, but the translators have said in this kind of setting, that's what it amounts to, that the man is recognizing that Jesus is worthy of worship. He is God's agent, or as we'd say, God in the flesh. Any comments there?
Hear me?
Yes.
Okay, yeah. Is it possible? Probably it's more than just, because in the Old Testament, I don't see any people worshiping the prophets or even Moses. But in this case, John used the word worship, so it could be more than just, like respect.
Yes. I think of another example in a different gospel when Jesus was coming back in the boat and he'd stilled the storm, and Matthew says the disciples worshiped him. And Matthew knows, in early Christian church, we see elsewhere, like in Revelation 1, it's not appropriate to worship an angel. It's not appropriate to worship these prophets, for example. Yeah, so they're using this word worship, well, maybe not to out and out say that Jesus is God, but they're implying that he is worthy of the same honors that we give to God. Kind of a cautious way of phrasing it there. And that and we read it in the New Testament, and we can see there that the people were giving Jesus all these honors, and that is what developed into more understanding that he is worthy of that, and that's where God is leading us, and you couple that with his the unusual circumstances of his birth, the stories they had heard about Zechariah's dream and Mary's the angel appearing to her. Then they put more and more of these things together and arrive. It's like they get boxed into the corners as well. There's no other conclusion but that Jesus is God. That God had promised to come to his people, and this isn't the way we expected him to do it, but this is what happened. And so he was God in the flesh, giving us the words of God, doing the deeds of God, teaching us the way God said that he would. So yeah, it's this word worshipped shows this is an unusual level of adoration or respect that's not appropriate for that we see elsewhere. It's not appropriate for any other, anyone that's not God. And so that these are, and that's why the translators, at least in this case, have used the word worship rather than just kneel before him. They said, all right, they were treating him the way they would God. Okay, verse 39. Jesus said, "For judgment I have come into this world, so that the blind will see, and those who see will become blind."
kind of a reversal of fortunes. The rich will be made poor and the poor rich. And in this case, those who think they see will find out that they really weren't seeing. Those who admit that they couldn't see, that, all right, we don't know, they're open then to teaching. And this, he says judgment. I don't think he's referring to the kind of judgment in which there's a courtroom and a judge sitting at the bench and separating people like this. But this is simply a natural result of people either accepting him for who he is and those who aren't. The people are sorting themselves out, as they were. Some will go this way to belief, some will go that way to unbelief. And maybe others will say, well, we don't know. We're afraid to make a decision. But there's some sort of judgment going on where people can, but based on how they respond to Jesus. Verse 40, some Pharisees who were with him heard him say this, and they asked, what do you mean by that? Are you saying that we are blind? Verse 41, and if you were blind, you would not be guilty of sin. If you're living in ignorance, that's excusable. But now that you claim you can see, your guilt remains. You claim to see, but you're not accepting what you see. What you see is that Jesus is performing these signs, these giving evidence that he is the Messiah, and you're not accepting the evidence. You're sticking to your the conclusions you had before, and you're not willing to, like you're seeing but not seeing. You're not comprehending what's going on here. You can see it, but it's not computing. So your guilt remains, he says. Because you claim to see, you're held to a different standard of response. Any comments? Yes, Bernie.
That last statement, but now that you claim you can see, you're guilty. Is it possible that a blind person can claim they see, but actually they don't? Because like on the cross, when Christ was on the cross, he said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. I don't know if that applies to the Pharisees, but maybe Christ is just stating, okay, because you claim, then you should be guilty, but maybe in reality, they're still blind.
You're probably right. Yeah, people erroneously think they're understanding. Jesus implies here that the Pharisees, as religious leaders, had enough information that they should have been able to make the right decision. There are many other people in this world who don't have enough information and yet still claim to have to know what's going on. They're just opinionated. So that they can claim to see but are actually blind. So their judgment status is kind of murky. It's not really addressed by this particular verse. Maybe I was kind of accidentally hitting at that when I mentioned a third category of those who weren't quite sure what to say. And John brought that up earlier, that they don't want to make a decision. I see evidence on this side. I see evidence on this side. I'm not willing to make the choice yet. And how Jesus deals with them, well, that's up to him, I guess. Anybody else? All right.
got a few more minutes here. We can get into chapter 10. This is a very familiar metaphor, and this is one of the passages that is in John. John doesn't tell parables in the same way that Matthew, Mark, and Luke have parables, but this passage is kind of like a parable because he's drawing an extended analogy. And here, this the good shepherd. So here, it's like the story is continuing to flow. The chapter breaks were inserted later, but here he's still talking to the same Pharisees. Very truly, I tell you, Pharisees, anyone who does not enter the sheep pen by the gate, but climbs in by some other way, as if that were possible, is a thief and a robber. So he's definitely giving a different analogy here than before. He was talking about spiritual blindness, the blind being the metaphor of choice there. Now he's shifting it to something else, the sheep. Exactly where is the sheep pen? What does it represent? Well, that's not completely clear. Maybe we might call it the group of God's people. That's why I was saying that, can someone climb in by some other way? Spiritually, no, people cannot climb in by some other way. But in the physical world, yes, thieves and robbers can climb into a sheep pen. So there's the struggle there between the metaphor and, as they say, all analogies break down when you press the details. Nothing completely corresponds perfectly, otherwise it wouldn't be a metaphor. So he's saying, all right, there's just verse 1, he's saying that there is a right way to get into the sheep pen, a right way to be part of God's sheep, and other ways are indicative of being a thief and a robber. They're the wrong ways to go about it. Verse 2, the person who enters by the gate is the shepherd of the sheep. So
your screen chat, can you, screen, can you share the scripture?
Oh yeah, sorry. All right. You don't have these memorized? All right. Verse 2, the one who enters by the gate is the shepherd of the sheep. Well, that's here the metaphor gets mixed a bit because who is the shepherd of the sheep? Well, we'd think that's Jesus, and that's what he says later. Jesus is the shepherd. But is Jesus entering by the gate? But Jesus is the gate. He is the way, the truth, the life. So some of the parts of this analogy, it's hard to get it to mesh exactly with the spiritual symbolism. The overall picture is there's a right way to get in and there's a wrong way to get in. The wrong way doesn't get you in, basically. Verse 3, the gatekeeper, the one, here's another person there, is the one who's entering is the shepherd. And then there's a gatekeeper. This is another person involved here. The gatekeeper opens the gate for the shepherd, and the sheep listen to his voice. So the sheep are listening to the gatekeeper's voice. But then, he calls his own sheep by name. So these roles of gatekeeper and shepherd are kind of merging, overlapping. And I don't know enough about ancient shepherding practices to know exactly how that would work. I know how they would build pens for the sheep to, corral them in at nighttime. They would usually use like a cliffside, and then have to create a couple of the walls, and then they would use rocks to build walls. Rocks are in abundant supply there. The rocks to build the walls, the other walls, and of course they'd have a gate with not a gate as we would, not one on hinges, but their gate would simply be logs stacked up on in between a couple pillars of rock. And so then they would remove those logs to make the gate and put it back. That hinges were not that readily available. It's so that was the custom. Why they would have a separate gatekeeper and a different shepherd, I'm not sure. Maybe any of you have read on that. Okay, I'll look at something this next week and see if I can find anything out there. Well, we're about out of time, so maybe we'll leave it at that. But we find the gatekeeper listening to the voice, or the sheep listening to the gatekeeper's voice, and he is calling his sheep by name and leads them out. Presumably, the shepherd could do that too. So that's why I'm not clear as to how those two roles intersect or interact. All right. We'll resume that next week then. Any other comments?
Probably all three referring to Jesus.
Yeah, in a way. I guess it's like in the book of Hebrews, Jesus is both the priest and the sacrifice. So Jesus has a dual role in that metaphor as well. Yeah. So maybe that's
trying to connect it with the triune God, Father, Son, Spirit, but then face Jesus, the shepherd is Jesus. That's maybe the gatekeeper is the Father, but hey, it's one God anyway.
All right. Well, we've got a week to think about it.
Yeah, the homework.
All right. Let me close that and stop the recording.